Delusions of Grandma is not what it says it's about. And I'm very confused having read this book and quite enjoyed it. I will talk more about my thoughts on the actual narrative itself, but I'm very confused by the title and the description of the narrative on the plot description. For example, on the back of the book it says something, 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 and then her own show business mother begins to muscle in a grandmother to be with a string of first night fantasies. Based on this description in the title, it sounds like this book is primarily about Cora, our protagonist, who is pregnant, and her mother, the baby's grandmother, of course, kind of interfering and giving her a lot of unsolicited advice. That's what it sounds like. That's what it's being sold as. The grandmother doesn't appear until page 167, and there are only about 240 pages. And for quite a while, the baby isn't the fetus is not the focus of this book. So it's actually a really unusual title and is nothing like what this is about. So I'm really confused as to why they made that decision, because it's actually kind of false advertising. Obviously, a lot of books say they're about one thing and you read them and they're actually about something different. This book is actually about families and our different kinds of families, because it focuses on Cora, who is writing these letters to her unborn child, who she names Esme. And to be honest, there are maybe 6 or 7 letters in this, and they're about 2-3 pages long each. I was under the impression it was more of an epistolary written primarily in letters. So again, that's something that is really heavily focused on based on the book. I've seen it in other people's reviews as well. I'm not entirely sure they read the books or read the book, but there are not that many letters in it. But that doesn't bother me. To be honest, I'm not the biggest fan of the epistolary in general, so for me that was actually kind of a relief. But it starts out with her discussing her relationship. It's in third person, but we learn about Cora's relationship with Ray, and the bulk of the book is about her relationship with Ray and how that progresses, and then how they eventually conceived this child. And it may not seem important the night that this child was conceived, but actually it really is, and it's a pivotal plot point involving one of their friends, Cora's dear friend called William. I don't want to say too much about this character, but I will say the chapters surrounding William were very powerful and very moving. The book is, well, it's funny. It is meant to be comedic, but it's tastefully done, and I think a lot of the humour comes from these brilliantly written characters. Carrie Fisher, I love her. I haven't mentioned this in this discussion, but I've mentioned it many times before on my channel. I am madly in love with Carrie Fisher. I am devoted to her very existence. The essence of her name is delicious. But she has a very waffly writing style when it comes to prose. And her writing style is not the best. It's not bad, but there are times in this, particularly in the kind of the first half, before I felt she really got into her stride, it was a little bit waffly. But the character writing is absolutely beautiful. These characters feel realistic, they feel multidimensional. I really feel like I got to know these people as individuals, and the writing surrounding William is so beautiful and so moving. And William is not a relative of hers, but you get to know these characters as if they are part of Cora's family. Not a blood family, but the individuals who are so close to her that it is a de facto family. And that's really interestingly contrasted with her relationship with Ray in the way that that develops. And you kind of feel like her relationship with Ray is kind of segregated from the rest of her relationships. And that's something she keeps completely separate to the rest of her de facto family. And it's such an interesting dynamic, and the way that that kind of develops towards the end of the book, and where certain characters are there for her and certain ones aren't, I think is a very fascinating development. It's an enjoyable enough read once you get past the kind of the first half. The first half was a drag. It did take time to establish itself. Maybe if it hadn't been written by Carrie Fisher, maybe I wouldn't have persevered. I don't know. Also, it's worth pointing out, I remember reading, I don't know where I read this, but I read a quote somewhere from Carrie where she was saying that she finds it odd that people think that her novels are autobiographical, and that she thinks people just don't think she has an imagination. The mother character in this, called Viv, moved from Texas to LA when she was a little child, began a career in Hollywood, and is now opening a museum of Hollywood costumes in Las Vegas. Does that remind you of anybody? That is literally Debbie Reynolds' story. So I find it very unusual that she not only wrote the mother character or the grandmother character to be kind of like Debbie, but that it is literally Debbie's autobiography. She came from a slightly different place in Texas, although El Paso does get a mention. And she moved there when she was 7 rather than 10, and she became a seamstress rather than an actress. But definitely that character is not just based on her mother, that character is her mother with a different name. Which I think is really interesting because it makes me think, well, how much of Cora is Carrie Fisher? Because, I've read some of her other books. For example, Postcards from the Edge. I think Suzanne is very heavily based on Carrie's own experiences. But I believe it was actually a discussion about that book where Carrie said that she thinks it's odd that people think she just doesn't have an imagination and bases everything on her own life. But that book clearly is based on some of her own experiences. Whereas this one, I didn't ever find myself thinking that this is definitely Carrie Fisher's pregnancy experience and this is definitely how her family dynamic works. But then, 2/3 of the way into the book, the character of Viv, of the grandmother, she appears, and I realise that character is 100% based on Debbie Reynolds. So, how much of the rest of the book is based on Carrie's own experiences? Of course, we may never know this, unless she's divulged this in an interview somewhere. If she has, and you know of that's existence, please let me know. I'd love to give that a read. But obviously that is a question that, if I could, I would love to have asked her. It's an interesting read. If you're a fan of Carrie, definitely read it. If you're not a fan of Carrie, and you don't mind sitting through about 100 pages of waffly writing to get to what is actually a really compelling, moving story, I think from the point where William comes in, and then Cora discovers she is pregnant soon after, from that point onwards, it becomes an interesting narrative, and the character writing just grows. Delusions of Grandma is quite literally not what it says it's about, but I still thought it was a pretty good read, and one that I'd say is worth having a look at.